historical clues and reconstructing the scene. Cliff, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, John. Let's see, can you hear me? Yes. Good, good. Yes, visible evidence, meaning things you'll see in the dirt to this day, historical clues that we can gain from the photographic legacy that we're blessed with, and reconstructing the scene in regards to model making. So just a little bit of refresher course from last year's material. In 2012, I began designing a computer model for a physical model of the Hale and Norcross mine in the sort of 1890 era. Last year, in May, the actual model, physical model construction began. And if you were here last year in October, you saw the state of affairs of the model up to that point. What I didn't elaborate on last year was that 2 days before that talk, I had been for the first time to the Hale and Norcross site, and a lot of things sort of changed the course of the model making effort. So we'll begin with a really brief overview and research and model making wise up to a year ago today. When you take the train from the F Street Depot, you go south past the Savage, and you go beneath this wonderful old trestle there, and I've been assuming that this was part of the Hale and Norcross dump. So obviously, since I wanted to make a model of the dump, I later came by and poked around and wanted to get some dimensions and so forth. But this was not looking anywhere like the Watkins photos, for example. So I started having my questions about it. But if you walk about 200 feet south, and this is looking back north, and this is what really excited me, you'll see in the grass remains of a very substantial stone retaining wall. And that's what you would expect to see supporting the Hale and Norcross main ore bin. And sure enough, the methodology of construction, dry laid stone with a flat face, is very similar to that what you see at the Savage retaining wall and around the V&T, in this case opposite the Vivian Mill. So clearly an old retaining wall. Opposite the tracks from the northern part of that retaining wall, here's this interesting little vent. It's poking up through what appears to be waste dump material. And this vent has two posts, which is more like what you'd expect to see because that's what the Watkins photos show for the tramways for the dump. I went to Google Earth back in my hotel room and I was trying to find evidences. So we see that little vent, can't quite see the retaining wall. There's something going on up here, and of course there's the big trestle. So the big question I had was, how does all this stuff relate to the Hale and Norcross mine? Because I needed to make a model of it somehow. So now we'll go through some photos as I had to do to refresh my memory on what was going on with the Hale and Norcross surface works. You know, here's the big long trestle that's coming out of it. And you know that the Hale and Norcross, along with being a major producer of bullion, especially in its early years, it was a huge producer of waste material. And they needed all these wonderful tramways to move that material. And if you're going to make a model of one of these Comstock mines, it's such a signature aspect of all these mines. And I think they're just gorgeous, really, from an architectural standpoint. This is, well, I'll talk about that later. Anyway, so I was determined to include all that. And this is the 2012 computer model, along with that trestle you just saw, based entirely on Watkins and the sandboard maps and so forth. And I showed you last year, here's where I was heading with the same dump approach as of a year ago. And you saw, you know, the walls and foundations and so forth a year ago, and the ore bins and the ore chutes. So now we're up to date as of 1 year ago today, basically. what I couldn't tell you a year ago was that when I went on site, there was a whole bunch of things that totally screwed up my model making effort. So now we're going to go specifically in the Hale and Norcross dump system. Modeling and research time frame a year ago through the remainder of the year. I couldn't help myself but do a little trespassing. I climbed up on the top of this hill and took a shot of the vent going back down. I know you're not supposed to do that, but the devil made me do it. And you see some beams going into the dirt. And if you back up, and this is a shot towards the north, here's the, you can't quite see it, but that vent that you just saw to the west along the track, that's there. But on the other side, there remains of a vent also here facing the fairgrounds. In between, there's a bunch of timbers that connect these vents, and another vent like there, barely visible. But there's some sort of shed going on here. So what's that shed? Because I wasn't accounting for it in my model. And what's below the shed? There's something going on here, but I didn't want to poke around because, you know, for all I knew, some watchman had a rifle sights trained on me, and so you know, I just rolled down the hill and called it a day. But I expected to see some remains of that big, huge curved trestle branching to the northeast. But instead, there was this shed with some sort of structure going on beneath it, and I realized that I know nothing about this. So I had to go back to the historical clues. And it started with Sanborn, and this is a good opportunity to say, to mention that the dump system is comprised of two subsystems. The ore dump is a subsystem where you accumulate this material for eventual loading into a vehicle and transporting it to the mills. I mean, that's intuitive, right? But they call it ore dump, but it's interchangeable with the term ore bin. The waste dump, you just want to get it out of there. And the waste dump particularly requires all this wood to get these tramways to get it out of there. So let's start with the Hale and Norcross ore dump subsystem. You all know about this wonderful bin that was built with the main facility around 1869, probably slightly before the V&T got there. So maybe they did mule or horse-drawn wagon loads up until the time the V&T track was laid. But let's not forget the other ore dump. This is really important, this little sample bin. In times of low or no ore production, such as when this photo was taken, you really have to have still a means to accumulate your ore, to transport it to a mill, to see if you're hitting really nice, rich pay dirt, right? So the V&T was no longer, was not at this time servicing this dump. So that made this little dump really important. It would, straight out of the ore house, they would dump it into this sample bin, and by tramway or whatever means, get it to another mill to assess the value and otherwise process. The other form of dump is the waste dump subsystem. And just to, this is a later shot, it's out of sequence chronologically, but I want to give you an idea of just how much material was involved. All these fingers radiating out from the main straight trestle later on, this is beyond the V&T low line, which is here. And to give you an idea of how tall those are, this tramway corresponds with the top of all those waste ridges. They went down all the way to below where the modern fairgrounds are. These are on F Street. This is way down on, I don't know, H or whatever street. Where did all that material come from? Where? Well, as you know, Hale and Norcross shaft, the incline, went all the way beneath the canyon to the combination shaft on the other side to a depth of almost a half mile. So when you combine that with its various cross cuts and drifts and so forth, that's just an enormous amount of material to have to get rid of. And to do so, you have to have a series of tramways, which means a bunch of trestles. You build a trestle out into space, and you start dumping, and the trestle would bury itself. Now, model making wise, the buried trestle is a little bit boring, but there remained some exposed trestles, which are more of a candidate for modeling, and also which are near where the facility was. So let's talk about these. The bin end trestle, I'm just making this term up, I don't know what it was called. It shot out from the south end of the ore house southward, and it was kind of short-lived. You don't see it much after this, but my guess is that it was built with the original structure in '69, and then when the V&T finally laid its tracks and put its switch over here instead of to the north, maybe someone just had a, oops, that's not going to work, because if you use this for an ore dump, it would flood the V&T tracks. So that didn't happen. But the main subject of the story, the straight trestle, it began at the shaft house, proceeded through a covered bridge, through the ore house, across the V&T main line, over to a chute, and dumped to the little sample bin. From the straight trestle forked this magnificent curved trestle to the northeast. This curved trestle was the main means of dumping. So at this time, at least, this straight trestle was part of the ore dump system. The curved trestle was basically the waste dump system. Another shot looking from the V&T low line. Modeling wise, the components I was expecting to include was the single span bridge, long single span bridge, from the ore house to the fork where the curved trestle proceeded, the straight trestle went to the chute, down, and to the little sample bin. No, oops. What happened? Am I pushing the button the wrong way? Oh, thank you. By the way, this shot shows the little tramway to a mill, which had been right here. Am I? Oh, pointing towards the dang screen. Sorry. But after this time, immediately after these photos were taken, a lot of changes happened to this whole arrangement of equipment. And it was, well, I'll just sum up. I'm going to give you a preview on all these changes. Stephen found this at Fred Hollibird's auction and immediately alerted me to it. There's so much things that are going on here. I'm going to start with a bullet list of the main things. Between 1880 and 1885, the curved trestle had been removed. The straight trestle was extended beyond the sample bin and had become the main dumping avenue now. The straight trestle span over the V&T main line was strengthened with a more substantial bridge, and at the curved trestle's chopped off fork was erected a new structure of some kind. Now, to dissect that photo a little bit more, what had been a single truss bridge is now a double truss bridge with a new bent supporting that joint. Here's the shed I mentioned, and the straight trestle goes beyond where the chute for the sample bin had been eastward. There's still a chopped off fork, I think, to the curved trestle, even though the curved trestle is not there. And the way know the curved trestle is there is that its handrail post would have been interfering with this nice even pattern. You'd see its handrails, but instead we see a bit of the fork. And when you look closely at this photo, all of these bents are seen edge on except one bent, and that's right here. You see it at a 45-degree angle, so it's supporting just a little bit of where the curved trestle took off. So this raises a whole bunch of questions, especially, is this an ore bin? Is this an ore bin here? Is this a chute of some sort related to this activity? is this a road for wagons to accept ore? Because we see wagon wheel ruts and so forth. I didn't know. So a shot from Stephen's collection. From the north, we see the shed perched on what sure looks like a mighty tall foundation. We see the same diagonal thing, but it's unclear what it is. So I was completely stumped by this time. You saw that this is where I was going, but now should I do something like this? And I didn't know. In the meantime, I had to move on if I was ever going to talk to you about this model this year, because it was really, the project was dragging on. So the roof modules involve a lot of structure, a heck of a lot of shingles. The cupolas, the catwalks, stairs, stacks, lighting in the cupolas, all kinds of stuff. And we have ladders, a lot of platforms and handrails, and then there's the water tank, and so forth. But to go forward and make the final module of this whole project, I needed to know some answers. What was that shed? What was going on underneath it? And if it was an ore bin, did its chute go to the east or to the west? Because that would determine where the wagon loading road would be. And what was that diagonal thing hanging off? So now this is the main effort, the main investigation. I turned to Google Earth once more to see if there were clues on the terrain. Here's the shed, but it was inconclusive from a satellite point of view where the chute was. And I took so few photos when I was there, I couldn't read any more into it than from that view. So wouldn't it be great if some exploration can take place, and with the proper permission, take some decent photos of the site, describe the dang shed, and discover what's underneath it, and hopefully get some clues on where that ore chute was pointing. So let me introduce to you the first Hale and Norcross Dump Expeditionary Team of February 24th, 2018. And thank you, Mike Collins, for suggesting I get in touch with Pam. It was all downhill from there. I mean, in a good sense, everything came together thanks to Pam, because she knew Scott, who, amongst being chairman of the Virginia City Tourism Commission and owner of a bunch of mines, he's the property owner as well. Then John Duffy, our illustrious VP and MC. Of course, you know Joe Curtis, and those three, on one bitterly cold and very windy day, scaled the peaks of H&N's last remaining waste dump. And now we see some good shots. This is the west wall. I thought it was a roof, but this is a wall, and it is flopped over. It is flopped over the floor. And into the floor, this is the trajectory of the main straight trestle. There's an abrupt turn for the ore skip to be horsed 90 degrees and turned into the shed. And there's an opening in the floor for receiving dump material. And we see a significant structure going on underneath there. Looking from below, John took this shot of that same 90-degree turn. This is not a mere pedestrian platform or deck. These are 12 by 12s. They're substantial enough to support a loaded ore cart for sure. That twisted east bent, when I was there last week, I was able to look at these things for myself, and it's sure enough a bent. And what had happened is that the north post, there's two posts, the north post had been broken, and it had fallen over to the south, dragging its crossbeam with it. So it's out of alignment for everything, but it's still one of the original bends. The northern wall of the shed is flopped to the ground, and the rest of the walls are just blown out, and the roof, for that matter, has debris scattered down the hill. From the northwest, here's the part of that opening in the floor. It's a deliberately framed opening. This isn't just missing pieces of floorboard. This is where the ore cart came here and dumped somewhere along the side of that wall. And it's obviously an ore bin going on beneath. The southern corner, Pam took this shot. This is not the floor of the ore bin. This is dirt that has invaded the space of the ore bin. But nevertheless, you see a brace on that wall and a brace on the opposite wall. And often the braces are often parallel to the floor in these bin structures. So that would be a hint that the floor is also going towards the east, towards this direction. Furthermore, if you look down into it, and I didn't include a shot for that, but it's all dark, but you can obviously see that the eastern side of this pit is the deeper side. When you combine that with just the terrain, you know, standing there looking at the terrain, the position of this bin on a steep slope to the east, you can pretty well determine that this is dumping towards the east and not the west. The second expeditionary team was Pam again, with blessing and sponsorship by Scott, and Justin Hensley, a professional aerial photographer who Pam brought in because they've done projects together like this. He came in and took some wonderful shots. I can only show a fraction of those to you, but here's the western bent that you see along the tracks. Its remaining structure of trestle beams. There's some more beams inside this tree, and then the ground falls away. And again, if this had not been twisted, it would have been right here in perfect alignment with all the rest of that. Here's the north wall flopped down. You see, you're seeing through the ore bin because the bin sheathing has, from the ground level up, has been removed, whether by forces of nature or firewood seekers or so forth. And by the way, the sheathing of the bin is both inside and outside. It's sheathed on the inside, like all bins, to keep the ore in, but it's sheathed on the outside to keep the waste rock out. Great shot. There's some of the transverse the timbers where there's probably an iron plate where the skip was horsed over 90 degrees and into the shed. I had taken a tape measure. This is a total perfectly opportunity to measure how high the shed was because the north wall is intact and laying on the ground. But by the time I hoofed it up to this place, I had lost my tape measure somewhere down below, and I kept trying to retrace my steps, and I couldn't find the dang thing. But so that's life. While this was going on, or in addition to this activity, Stephen and I were collecting photos of or anything capturing this shed, because what I needed to determine was for sure the connection between what's here in ruin-wise that in the dirt to this day. I wanted to connect it with that 1885 photograph to make sure we're talking about the same shed. So here we go. This is the 1885 shot and 90 shot. 1908, here's the little shed. It's hidden behind some bridge work of the tramway that went over the B&T low line, but it's still there. Again, 1908. It's blurry, but it's still nice and perched up high on that little bin. We see also the remaining fork to the curved trestle that's been chopped off. Even though it's blurry, there's a definite break from this horizontal line from right there over. And I'm fairly reasonably convinced that that was the chopped off part of the curved trestle. 1914, the shed's doing fine and the bin is fine, but by this time waste material has filled in wherever the chute was. And also notice that the straight trestle had been whacked off. It no longer spans the B&T low line. This is a wonderful map. I saw this on Nevada Bureau of Mines and Geology online collection. And it's interesting because it, well, I'm going to back up. In 1914, you see that the ore house and therefore the ore bin are just fine. In 1923, though, they're proposing to rebuild the ore house. So that means it had gone, it had been burned or something. And in 1923, they also wanted to relay the V&T siding to serve the new ore bin that they wanted to rebuild. The V&T siding is in dash line, the existing track is in solid line. Also, here's the V&T loan line, it says to the conva. They wanted to re-extend the straight trestle back and connect it to its waste dump. But they also wanted to rebuild the little bin, or a smaller version of the little bin, and dump into a car on the siding. You see these little rectangles, that's where an ore chute would be. So here's the second section view from the same drawing. Here's the chute, here's the ore bin, and it would dump directly on a car waiting on the V&T load line. Here's the dash line representing the ore bin, and the dash line representing the V&T ore car sitting there. This was all just proposed in 23. In 33, we see that the straight trestle was again built across the low line, now no longer using truss bridges, but typical trestle bent construction. And here's our little shed. Still doing fine. It's right here in the large shot. Definitely there in 33. In 37, we're standing here on East Street. We're looking across, upon the straight trestle. It's spanning the V&T main line. It's going past the shed. It's spanning the V&T low line and radiating out into all its waste trestles. 39, same story. Everything is intact. This is the cupola of the Comstock mine down there that's still there. This is a great shot by Arthur Rothstein, whom Stephen mentioned in the latest Telegraph. It's from Library of Congress. In the foreground, we see the reconstructed Hale and Norcross trestle. And we see the Arizona's trestle now, and the Arizona Comstock trestle. And this is the first time we see these together. Let's point out several things that the Comstock merger mines had proposed in 27, but here were actually accomplished. Here's that chute that they drew in their drawing. And if you look closely, you'll see the rails of the V&T siding were relayed. However, the little ore bin was not built, even though the chute was there. And the big ore bin was not built, even though the siding was laid in. And I'm guessing that somewhere along the line, the Comstock, or the Arizona Comstock people had said, you know, this is a stupid way to get rid of ore. We're gonna change the whole thing. The Hale and Norcross is going to be used as the dump system alone. And we're going to build a whole new ore dump system. So waste for the Hale and Norcross, ore for this new thing. And that's what you ride beneath when you take the train. And there's this huge ore bin right there. Another shot, same photographer, same day probably. And we see that the amazing, huge dump trestle, ore dump trestle by the Arizona Comstock is like 3 lanes wide. And, you know, the little shed and bin, they're just fine. So that pretty much it nails it, that the bin from the historical photographs are the remains of the bin that you see up on the hill today. So I went with the shed on a bin, dumping to the east. A couple points I needed to clarify or come to a conclusion with. I needed to know where the wagon road was, and in the 1885 photograph in the distance you see these 4 big timbers canted over at a little angle, and they're very reminiscent of the retaining walls used by the overmen and other mines in this period of time. So I'm guessing or concluding that they excavated a little road there to accept ore from the chute. But it's hidden by the shoulder of this dump, and that's how I modeled it. You don't see the road from this angle. And so again, what was that little hangy-downy thing? Didn't know. But I had to assume that it was a stairway because the chute was going the opposite direction. And the more you think about it, if a guy is working up here, keeping his eye out for a wagon, he needs to, get down there really quick to operate the ore gate to fill the wagon. So at least that's how I approached it. This is what is blurrily seen in the photos, but I had to totally wing it for the remaining stairway and the ore chute. Now, back into construction, same sort of thing, a whole bunch of lasered acrylic, which mainly went into the hill. Now, at the time, this seemed like a good idea to me, but I'm never going to do it like this again. There's an enormous amount of acrylic. So this was the fun part, spraying in foam and waiting a day and carving it and sanding it. The tramways are a couple of layers excuse me, of acrylic, and they're sheathed with cedar beams and planked with cedar. There's the bridge from the ore house. It should have been 2 bridges at this time, but as everything else in this project, everything's very foreshortened. The chopped off fork to the curved trestle ending in the platform for the shed, and the transverse tramway so that the ore car could come in and dump. And I'll just show you a few shots of the final thing. These are ground up plastic foam which were pressed into an epoxy clay, which is rated for outdoor use. I used about 4 shades of brown paint to roughly emulate what you see out there today. And I had to chop the trestle off, even though historically it kept going way to the east. I ran out of room at this point. This whole superstructure of the deck and the house, and there's a little garage that plugs into here. That's an animated module. It lifts off for storage during the winter, indoor storage, but it has its own little computer programmer thing and a sound system and stuff, and the little miner comes out pushing a car, and the doors open, and he argues with the dude in the shed, and it's kind of lame, but anyway, June 12th, my buddies Jerry and Bruce helped me to take the sucker out and put all the pieces together, finally, on the slab which had been poured in 2014. The planting of the flagpole ceremony. And I had to carefully register and elevate where the pad would go because the alignment was pretty critical between all these pieces. And there's the pad. And on September 1st, my wife and I brought out the baby. We weren't using the pram to be cute. The pram has really good suspension on it. And it's a really rocky path, So here it is plopped on the ground. And I'm going to just show you some final pics, but we'll lead into them with the historical shots. So here's this historical, and here's the model. Of course, it's missing one of these, and it's missing a lot, but I'm hoping to get in the main elements. And from the north, and there it is, and here's the little doors that open, and from the west, and a little ground shot to wind up with. if you would like to see this thing at your own speed, and I'd be glad to give you the Gold Hill version, which I did last week, which has a bunch more material, and it goes into a final section on my own personal theories, rightly or wrongly, into why things were rearranged between 1880 and 1885. Also some interesting mysteries that I haven't been able to solve, maybe you'll be able to. So if you'd like that presentation, or the presentation from last year, or some of the animations, just let me know, or hand me your info on a piece of paper. Photo credits, all the usual suspects, with especially Stephen Drew helping me all along the way, as usual. And each slide is noted for the contemporary stuff. If it's not noted, it's by me. And so, thank you to Pam Abercrombie, Joe Curtis, Stephen Drew, John Duffy, Justin Hensley, Scott Jolkover. Without this team, this project wouldn't have been nearly as complete or reliable or fun. You know. So, many thanks, and that's about it. Wow. Do I have time for a question or two? Whew. Can I answer any questions? Sir?
I didn't catch it, but was stated the scale of this observation?
1 to 24. Yeah.
Somebody make VT locomotives at that scale?
Yes, Heartland. Yeah, it's not quite standard gauge, but they